You are embarrassing this company, Richard Whitmore said, his voice cutting through the control room like cold steel. A black engineer does not interrupt my presentation. The words landed harder than the hum of the turbines behind him. Every conversation stopped. Every investor turned. Every camera swung toward Ava Johnson. She stood alone beside the rear console, one hand gripping a rugged diagnostic tablet, the other trembling only enough to tighten around its edge. The overhead lights reflected across polished steel walls, making the room feel brighter than it should have, almost painfully bright. Heat drifted from the massive hydrogen reactor beyond the reinforced glass. The low mechanical vibration beneath everyone's feet felt steady to most people. To Ava, it felt wrong. Sir, she said quietly, refusing to raise her voice. The pressure pattern is oscillating. It is not random. If you continue the startup sequence, the safety system may not respond fast enough. Richard let out a short laugh. Several executives followed. One investor exchanged an awkward smile with another, unsure whether to watch the presentation or the young engineer being publicly dismissed. Richard adjusted his tailored navy jacket and stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. Do you know why people spend millions trusting me? He asked. Ava held his gaze. Because they believe you listen to experts. His smile vanished for only a fraction of a second before returning colder than before. You maintain equipment. I run companies. Behind Richard, enormous display screens counted down toward the public activation of Whitmore Energy's newest hydrogen facility. 5 minutes remained. Television crews waited behind glass. Reporters adjusted microphones. The company's stock price had already climbed throughout the morning. Everything had been rehearsed. Everything except this. Ava looked down once more at the streaming data. Tiny fluctuations continued appearing every few seconds. Pressure. Temperature. Valve synchronization. Alone, each number seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern she had seen only once before during a federal engineering simulation. Her stomach tightened. She remembered another control room years ago, another manager who insisted production could not stop because delays cost money. She remembered the phone call that followed hours later informing her that her father would never come home from the refinery where he had worked for 23 years. Richard snapped his fingers, dragging her back into the present. Security. 2 uniformed guards immediately stepped forward. Their polished shoes echoed across the steel floor. One reached politely toward Ava's arm. Miss Johnson, we need you to step outside. She did not resist. She simply looked once more through the thick observation glass toward the reactor chamber where silver pipes disappeared into clouds of white vapor. A faint clicking sound reached her ears. Click. Pause. Click. Barely noticeable. Almost hidden beneath the roar of industrial fans. Her heartbeat accelerated. That sound should not have existed during a stable startup. Richard, she said one final time, her voice calm despite the growing knot in her chest. Please stop the sequence for 12 minutes. That is all I am asking. He turned his back before she finished speaking. Begin activation. Applause erupted from the invited guests. Flashbulbs exploded across the room. Ava was escorted toward the heavy security doors. Just before they opened, she glanced over her shoulder. On the massive central monitor, one tiny indicator that everyone else ignored silently shifted from green to amber. The amber light blinked once. Then again. Ava stopped walking. The security door hissed shut behind her, muffling the applause inside the control room, but not the deep vibration traveling through the concrete beneath her boots. She closed her eyes for half a second. The rhythm was changing. Too fast. Too uneven. One of the guards noticed her expression. Everything all right? Ava looked through the narrow safety window in the steel door. No, she whispered. The synchronization is slipping. Inside, Richard Whitmore stood beneath brilliant white lights, smiling for photographers as the giant countdown screen reached 1 minute. Investors clapped politely. The reactor's polished pipes shimmered behind thick reinforced glass, wrapped in waves of heat that distorted the air. Richard raised one hand toward the activation console. "Today," he announced, "Whitmore Energy proves that confidence changes the future." Outside, Ava's tablet vibrated. A new stream of numbers rolled across the display. Her pulse quickened. The pressure spike had spread beyond valve 7. It was moving downstream exactly as she feared. This was no faulty sensor. It was a chain reaction. She spun toward the nearest emergency wall panel, but her access badge flashed red. Authorization denied. One guard shifted uneasily. "Miss Johnson, you really should leave the restricted area." She did not move. "If I leave, everyone in that room loses their chance to stop this." Her calm voice carried more weight than panic ever could. The older guard looked through the window. Sweat appeared beneath his cap despite the chilled hallway. "You really think something is wrong?" Ava answered without taking her eyes off the readings. "I know it is." Back inside, one of the junior engineers frowned at his monitor. His fingers hesitated above the keyboard. A tiny amber warning had appeared in the corner of his screen before disappearing again. He glanced toward Richard, then toward the lead systems manager. Neither seemed concerned. Cameras continued flashing. The presentation continued. The engineer swallowed and quietly reran the diagnostics. The same warning returned. His heartbeat accelerated. Across the room, Richard rested his hand on the polished activation switch. 3. The audience leaned forward. 2. Outside, Ava suddenly heard it. Click. Pause. Click, click. The sound echoed faintly through the ventilation shafts like a heartbeat skipping inside the walls. Her face lost what little color remained. She stepped toward the reinforced door. "Open it!" The younger guard blocked her path. "I cannot! If that actuator locks, the emergency bypass will fail." The guard hesitated. "I need authorization." Ava looked directly into his eyes. "You will have authorization after the alarm. Right now you have a choice." His jaw tightened. Inside the control room, the junior engineer stood up so abruptly that his chair rolled backward across the polished floor. "Sir?" he called. Richard did not turn. The room was too busy watching history. The engineer checked another monitor. Then another. Every graph was beginning to mirror Ava's warning. Tiny deviations. Perfectly synchronized. Impossible to dismiss. His mouth went dry. "Sir!" he shouted again, louder this time. Richard finally glanced over his shoulder with visible irritation. "What?" Before the engineer could answer, every screen in the room flickered for a fraction of a second. The lights dimmed. The applause stopped. Somewhere deep beneath the building, a heavy metallic thud rolled through the foundation. Ava did not flinch. She had been waiting for that sound. Then every emergency beacon burst crimson at once, and one message spread across every monitor in the facility. Critical synchronization failure. Manual intervention required. Richard slowly turned toward the steel door where Ava had been standing only moments before, and realized she was gone. Richard Whitmore lunged toward the steel door just as another warning siren echoed through the building. "Where is she?" he barked. The two guards exchanged stunned looks. Ava Johnson had vanished into the maze of service corridors beneath the control room. Red emergency lights pulsed across brushed steel walls, painting every anxious face in flashes of crimson. The investors no longer looked impressed. They looked trapped. Phone cameras quietly appeared in trembling hands. Somewhere beyond the reinforced glass, the reactor released a low metallic groan that vibrated through the floor like distant thunder. Richard forced himself to stay composed. "Run the automatic override," he ordered. Fingers flew across keyboards. Nothing happened. The lead systems manager stared at his monitor, his breathing becoming uneven. "It is rejecting every remote command." Richard stepped closer. "That is impossible." The manager swallowed hard. "Not impossible. Manual control has priority now." Silence swallowed the room. Richard slowly turned toward the giant display. Every emergency pathway had turned gray except one. Maintenance Access Corridor C. The same corridor Ava had disappeared into. At the far end of the lower level, Ava sprinted through narrow concrete hallways lit by flickering industrial lamps. Warm air rushed from overhead pipes, carrying the sharp smell of hot metal and machine oil. Her boots struck the floor in quick rhythm while her tablet continued streaming live pressure readings. Every second mattered now. She reached a heavy maintenance hatch and slammed her badge against the reader. Read. Denied. She tried again. Read. Her jaw tightened. Come on! Behind her, hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor. One of the older security guards appeared, breathing heavily. He held up his own access card. Mine still works. Ava looked at him in surprise. Why are you helping me? The guard hesitated only a moment. Because you were the only person who sounded afraid before everyone else became afraid. The lock clicked open. Ava pulled the steel door wide. Heat rolled out like the breath of a furnace. Inside, rows of massive silver valves stretched beneath bright maintenance lights. Steam drifted through the air in thin white ribbons. Every vibration felt stronger here. Ava crouched beside Valve 7. Her fingertips rested lightly against the housing. Her eyes closed. 1 pulse. 2 pulses. Then a tiny irregular shudder almost too small to notice. She immediately looked toward the secondary pressure gauge mounted farther down the pipe. Her expression changed. No, she whispered. The guard frowned. What? Ava pointed farther into the chamber. Valve 7 was never the real problem. At that exact moment, upstairs, the lead systems manager finished tracing the pressure flow through every connected line. His face drained of color. Richard. The chief executive officer did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the frozen activation screen. Say it. The manager slowly enlarged the system diagram until the entire reactor network filled the display. Every blinking warning suddenly converged toward a single location. Valve 12. Richard stared at the screen in disbelief. Valve 12 had not been inspected in almost 8 years because every audit listed it as a passive backup component that could never activate during normal startup. He looked toward the maintenance records. One signature appeared on the most recent inspection request. Ava Johnson. Status: request denied. Richard felt his throat tighten. He remembered rejecting the maintenance budget himself 3 months earlier in favor of accelerating today's public launch. Across the control room, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound was the growing mechanical vibration beneath their feet. Down in the reactor chamber, Ava reached slowly toward the manual release wheel on Valve 12. Then she froze. Bolted across the mechanism was a brand new steel security seal that had not existed on any blueprint she had ever studied. Someone had locked the only emergency control from the inside. The new steel seal caught the harsh maintenance lights, gleaming like it had been installed only hours ago. Ava Johnson stared at it for one frozen heartbeat. Then she looked closer. Fresh tool marks scarred the bolts. Someone had opened this emergency valve recently, then locked it again. This is not standard, she said. The older guard leaned in, sweat rolling down his temple despite the cold ventilation overhead. Can you remove it? Ava tightened her grip around the manual release wheel. Not without authorization tools. Whoever sealed this knew exactly what they were doing. Above them, another warning tone echoed through the reactor chamber. The vibration beneath the grated floor grew sharper, faster, almost impatient. Upstairs, the control room had transformed from a celebration into controlled panic. Investors whispered behind raised hands. Reporters quietly lowered their microphones and lifted their phones instead. Every flashing red beacon reflected across polished glass walls and frightened faces. Richard Whitmore refused to step away from the center console. Find another override, he demanded. There has to be another one. The lead systems manager kept typing, his fingers shaking. Every new command returned the same answer. Manual intervention required. Richard slammed one palm against the steel workstation. The sound cracked through the room. Nobody flinched. Nobody answered. For the first time in years, the chief executive officer felt the room stop believing him. One investor slowly removed his event badge. Another whispered into his phone. The television producer signaled the camera crew to stop broadcasting. Richard noticed every movement. His perfect launch was collapsing one silent glance at a time. Down below, Ava studied the pressure map again. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes narrowed. Something still did not fit. If valve 12 had been deliberately sealed, the pressure should have risen faster. Instead, the surge kept pausing every few seconds, almost as if another system was buying them time. She followed the data stream backward across the tablet. One hidden maintenance circuit blinked faintly beneath layers of archived engineering files. Her heartbeat skipped. There is another safety loop. The guard frowned. Can it save us? Ava looked toward the maze of insulated pipes disappearing into the darkness. Only if someone designed it to work. Upstairs, Richard finally turned toward the engineering archives. Pull every design revision this plant has ever had. A technician hesitated. There are thousands. Then start searching. Seconds later, one old blueprint appeared on the main display. Yellowed skin marks crossed the digital image. Revision date, 11 years earlier. Chief Systems Engineer, Harold Johnson. Richard froze. The name hit him harder than the alarms. Harold Johnson. Ava's father. Around the room, confused executives exchanged looks. Richard remembered him now. Quiet. Brilliant. The engineer who had insisted on adding redundant manual safety pathways before the company rejected the proposal as unnecessary and too expensive. Richard had voted against the budget himself. The room fell silent except for the relentless mechanical hum beneath the floor. The lead systems manager zoomed into the forgotten blueprint. Hidden behind structural supports was an undocumented emergency bypass that connected directly to valve 12. Nobody had built it into the official operating manuals because the project had been cut before final approval. Wait, the manager whispered, his face draining of color. Someone finished it anyway. Richard looked up slowly. Who? The manager swallowed. Harold Johnson. Down in the reactor chamber, Ava pushed aside a row of insulated cables and aimed her flashlight into a narrow maintenance shaft barely wide enough for one person. Dust floated through the beam. At the far end, almost swallowed by darkness, a small green indicator glowed steadily. Unlike every other light in the building, it had never turned red. Ava stepped closer, the heat pressing against her face, and brushed decades of dust from a faded metal plate. Her breath caught. Someone had carved 6 words into the steel by hand. If this light is on, do not trust the system. The words carved into the steel seemed to silence even the alarms. If this light is on, do not trust the system. Ava Johnson ran her fingers across the worn letters. They were real. They had been cut into the metal years ago by someone who knew nobody would believe a warning written on paper. The green indicator continued glowing with quiet confidence while every official display above screamed red. Behind her, the older guard stared in disbelief. Your father left this? Ava swallowed hard. He left it for whoever arrived before it was too late. Another violent vibration rolled through the chamber. Fine dust drifted from the ceiling. Steam hissed between insulated pipes, filling the air with the sharp scent of heated metal. Ava opened the hidden access panel beneath the warning plate. Inside, rows of forgotten manual switches sat untouched beneath years of dust. One label immediately caught her eye. Independent safety loop. Offline. Upstairs, panic had replaced prestige. The investors who had arrived expecting champagne and headlines now stood shoulder to shoulder in uneasy silence. Phone cameras remained raised. Every whispered conversation seemed louder than the alarms themselves. Richard Whitmore watched the room slipping away from him, one frightened face at a time. His chief financial officer stepped beside him. The board is calling. Richard never looked away from the flashing monitors. Not now. They are demanding answers. Richard clenched his jaw. Tell them I am handling it. Nobody believed those words anymore. The lead systems manager suddenly spoke, barely above a whisper. Sir, Harold Johnson filed 12 reports about this backup loop. Richard turned sharply. What? The engineer opened archived company records on the main display. One report after another appeared. Safety concern. Deferred. Budget denied. Safety concern. Deferred. Budget denied. Every document carried the same electronic approval at the bottom. Richard Whitmore. The room became painfully still. One investor slowly lowered his phone. Another looked directly at Richard with open disbelief. Even the reporter stopped speaking. Richard stared at his own digital signature repeated across the screen. His breathing became shallow. He remembered every meeting. Every decision had seemed practical. Every delay had saved money. Every warning had come from an engineer he thought worried too much. He had never imagined those decisions would return in front of cameras, shareholders, and the very people whose trust built his empire. Down below, Ava brushed away another layer of dust and found a handwritten note folded inside a sealed maintenance sleeve. The paper had yellowed with age. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Harold Johnson. If you are reading this, the automated controls have failed exactly as I feared. They will tell you the computer knows best. It does not. Trust the pressure. Trust the vibration. Trust your instincts. Tears filled Ava's eyes, but she blinked them away before they could fall. She looked toward the massive manual lever mounted beside the forgotten safety loop. It had not moved in more than a decade. Rust clung to every hinge. The guard stepped closer. Can you activate it? Ava wrapped both hands around the cold steel handle. She tested it gently. Nothing. It would not move. Above them, another emergency siren changed pitch. Higher. Faster. More urgent. Upstairs, every display suddenly flashed a new warning across the wall-sized screens. Pressure escalation. Primary containment window, 90 seconds. Gasps spread across the control room. One television camera, still recording despite orders to stop, captured Richard Whitmore standing perfectly still as his own signature remained frozen beside 12 ignored safety reports. No one saw a powerful chief executive officer anymore. They saw the man who had refused to listen. Deep inside the reactor chamber, Ava planted her boots against the concrete, tightened her grip on the rusted emergency lever, and pulled with everything she had. For one endless second, nothing happened. Then somewhere deep inside the forgotten machinery, a single ancient gear moved with a loud metallic crack, followed immediately by a second sound that made Ava's heart stop. Someone else had just pulled a different lever from somewhere in the darkness. The second lever stopped moving almost as quickly as it had begun. Silence followed. Not complete silence, but the strange kind that only exists after panic has exhausted itself. The alarms did not disappear. They became slower, farther apart, each pulse echoing through the reactor chamber like a heartbeat refusing to give up. Ava Johnson released one hand from the rusted lever and listened. The violent vibration beneath her boots had changed. It was no longer spreading. It was waiting. Warm air drifted through the narrow maintenance corridor, carrying the faint scent of scorched insulation and machine oil. Tiny droplets of condensation slid down the silver pipes, catching the cold maintenance lights like falling glass. The older security guard barely breathed. Did we stop it? Ava kept her eyes on the pressure gauge. The needle trembled, then held perfectly still. No, she answered softly. Someone else just bought us time. Upstairs, the control room had become unnaturally quiet. Nobody applauded. Nobody whispered. Even the phone cameras that had been recording every second now remained frozen in steady hands. Investors stared at the giant displays as the flashing warnings slowed into a steady amber pulse. Richard Whitmore stood motionless beneath the white ceiling lights. For the first time that day, nobody looked at him for instructions. They were waiting for someone else. The lead systems manager broke the silence. Pressure is stabilizing. Richard looked up immediately. Then we are recovering. The engineer did not answer. His eyes remained locked on the monitor. No, sir. Richard frowned. What do you mean? The engineer slowly enlarged the pressure graph. Every system controlled from the central command room remained offline. Every automated safeguard was still disabled. Yet the reactor had begun stabilizing anyway. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. Someone is controlling the plant manually. The words settled over the room with crushing weight. One investor quietly lowered his phone. Another removed his glasses and stared through the reinforced observation window toward the reactor below. Richard followed their gaze. Somewhere beneath their feet, the engineer he had dismissed only minutes earlier was now doing what an entire command center could not. Down in the maintenance shaft, Ava moved carefully through another narrow passage illuminated only by a single strip of aging emergency lights. Every footstep echoed against concrete walls blackened by years of heat. She stopped beside a heavy mechanical housing where another faded metal plate had nearly disappeared beneath rust. Her flashlight swept across engraved initials. H.J. She reached forward almost instinctively. The steel felt warm, as though the machinery itself still carried the memory of the hands that built it. Beside the initials rested a folded photograph protected inside a cracked plastic sleeve. Ava carefully removed it. Her breathing slowed. The picture showed Harold Johnson standing inside this very chamber more than a decade earlier. Around him stood 12 engineers smiling proudly after the facility's original construction. Ava studied every face. Then her eyes stopped. One of the young engineers standing beside her father looked painfully familiar. Clean-shaven. Confident. Wearing an engineer's hard hat instead of an expensive suit. Richard Whitmore. Upstairs, Richard suddenly closed his eyes. Fragments of memory surfaced without warning. Long nights reviewing construction plans. Harold arguing for one final safety inspection. Richard insisting deadlines mattered more. He remembered Harold saying one sentence before leaving the meeting. Machines forgive mistakes. Pride never does. Richard had laughed then. The memory no longer felt distant. It felt personal. His phone vibrated again. Board members. Attorneys. Emergency management. He silenced every call without reading a single message. None of them mattered anymore. Across the room, the investors were no longer watching the monitors. They were watching Richard. Not with admiration. With questions. Back below, Ava turned the photograph over. A short handwritten message covered the back in faded black ink. If you ever find this room, you are not here by accident. Trust the person who opened the second lever. She slowly lifted her head. Somewhere beyond the concrete wall, hidden beneath the steady hum of cooling machinery, slow footsteps echoed through the darkness, moving toward her. Ava Johnson did not step back. She stood perfectly still as the footsteps drew closer through the dim maintenance corridor, each echo bouncing off concrete and steel with slow, deliberate rhythm. The older security guard instinctively shifted in front of her, but Ava gently touched his arm. Wait! The footsteps stopped just beyond the edge of the flashlight beam. An elderly man in faded maintenance coveralls emerged from the shadows, his silver hair damp with sweat, a heavy wrench hanging from one hand. His employee badge was so worn the photograph had nearly disappeared. He looked first at Ava, then at the photograph in her hand. His tired eyes softened. You have Harold's eyes, he said quietly. Ava felt her breath catch. You knew my father? The old mechanic nodded once. I built this emergency loop with him after everyone else went home. The words settled over the chamber with unexpected weight. Upstairs, the control room remained frozen beneath cold white lights. The emergency displays had stopped flashing wildly. Instead, a single ember status line pulsed across every monitor with slow, steady rhythm. Nobody celebrated. Nobody spoke. Every investor stared through the observation glass as if the answers lay somewhere beneath the concrete floor. Richard Whitmore watched the live maintenance cameras until one forgotten screen flickered back to life. Grainy black and white footage filled the display. Ava appeared beside the hidden safety chamber. Beside her stood the old mechanic no executive even remembered was still employed. Richard leaned closer. The room unconsciously followed him. The mechanic reached toward the rusted emergency assembly and pointed to a second wheel almost invisible beneath years of dust. "Everyone keeps trying to force the shutdown," he said. "Harold designed this system differently." Ava studied the mechanism without speaking. "It is not a shutdown system." The mechanic smiled faintly. "Exactly." Her eyes moved across the engraved arrows, the hidden pressure channels, the forgotten bypass loop. Suddenly the entire design came together inside her mind. The emergency system had never been meant to stop pressure. It redirected it gradually, protecting the reactor without shocking the network. Every official operating manual had interpreted the design incorrectly because nobody had ever consulted the engineer who built it. Ava placed both hands on the second wheel. "If I turn this too early, we lose containment. Too late, and the pressure returns." The mechanic nodded. "There is only one moment." Upstairs, the lead systems manager began comparing Harold Johnson's original blueprints with the company's official manuals. His fingers froze above the keyboard. "Sir?" Richard did not answer. He was staring at the maintenance camera. "The manuals were rewritten after construction." Richard finally looked toward him. "What changed?" The engineer swallowed. "Someone simplified Harold's safety sequence to save operating costs and training time." The room fell into complete silence. Richard slowly closed his eyes. He remembered signing that revision years ago without reading every page. Around him, the investors exchanged long, uneasy glances. The cameras recording the emergency captured everything. The powerful chief executive officer no longer looked like the man commanding the room. He looked like the man who had erased the very engineer trying to protect it. Down below, Ava inhaled slowly. The machinery no longer sounded violent. It sounded patient, as though waiting for her decision. The old mechanic stepped backward without another word. "Your father always trusted your instincts." Ava wrapped both hands around the wheel. Steam drifted through the cold light as tiny drops of water slid down the polished steel. The security guard watched without blinking. Upstairs, every monitor suddenly switched from the internal cameras to one single live sensor. "Pressure stabilization window available, 8 seconds." The entire control room stopped breathing. Richard whispered almost to himself. "Please." Ava looked once at her father's photograph, then turned the wheel with calm, steady hands. Deep beneath the building, the roar of the machinery faded into an almost impossible silence. Every warning light across the facility changed from amber to green, except one small indicator on the far corner of the main display. It blinked once, then slowly turned black. The black indicator remained dark. No alarms followed. No flashing lights returned. For one suspended moment, the entire facility seemed to forget how to breathe. Then the low mechanical hum settled into a smooth, even rhythm unlike anything heard that morning. The harsh vibration beneath the concrete floor disappeared. Steam drifted gently from the cooling pipes, no longer fighting the pressure inside them. Ava Johnson slowly released the wheel without saying a word. Her hands trembled from effort, but her face remained calm. The older mechanic smiled through tired eyes. "He always believed someone would understand." Ava looked down at her father's photograph before carefully sliding it back into the plastic sleeve. "He wanted people to trust the work," she whispered. "Not the man who built it." Upstairs, every monitor turned green one by one. The emergency banner vanished. A quiet murmur spread across the control room, replacing the fear that had ruled the building only minutes earlier. Investors lowered their phones. Reporters who had been recording disaster now found themselves filming something entirely different. Nobody rushed to speak first. They simply stared toward the maintenance camera where the young engineer stood beside machinery that every executive had failed to understand. Richard Whitmore remained motionless. The bright lights above reflected across the polished floor beneath him, but for the first time all morning, he looked smaller than the room around him. The lead systems manager broke the silence. She restored stabilization without a single automated command. Another engineer answered quietly. She did exactly what Harold Johnson designed the system to do. Richard lowered his eyes. Every sentence struck harder than the alarms ever had. He remembered dismissing Ava in front of the investors. He remembered laughing. He remembered telling her that maintenance workers did not belong in leadership. Those words now echoed louder than anything else in the room. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Moments later, Ava stepped into the control room wearing the same dust-covered work jacket she had worn all morning. Her gloves were stained with rust. A faint streak of grease crossed one sleeve. She did not walk like someone returning from victory. She walked like someone returning from work that simply needed to be done. Every conversation stopped. Every eye followed her. The investors who had avoided looking at her before now stepped aside without realizing they had moved. The silence carried more respect than applause ever could. Richard slowly walked toward her. His polished shoes echoed across the steel floor until he stopped only a few feet away. Neither of them spoke at first. The room waited. Finally, Richard removed the executive access badge hanging around his neck. His hand lingered on it for a moment before he lowered it to his side. "I was wrong," he said quietly. His voice no longer sounded like an order. "I looked at your title instead of your judgment." Ava held his gaze without anger. The reactor did not care about titles. Several people lowered their heads. One investor quietly nodded. Another executive wiped at his eyes before pretending to adjust his glasses. The words landed harder than any accusation could have. Richard inhaled slowly. "You saved every person in this building." Ava shook her head once. "My father did. I just listened." The older mechanic standing near the doorway smiled almost invisibly. Across the room, employees who had barely spoken to Ava before now watched her with open admiration. One young engineer straightened his shoulders as if seeing his profession differently for the first time. Another quietly closed the archived safety reports, no longer embarrassed by the name Harold Johnson at the bottom of each page. The atmosphere had changed completely. Respect had replaced doubt. Humility had replaced certainty. Yet Ava's eyes drifted toward the large observation window overlooking the silent reactor below. Something about the darkness of that single sensor still lingered in her thoughts. It had not failed. It had gone silent on purpose. She stepped closer to the glass, studying the calm machinery beneath the white lights. Then she noticed a small envelope resting alone on the control console, addressed in faded handwriting to only one person: Ava Johnson. The envelope rested alone beneath the soft white lights, untouched while the room remained silent around it. Ava Johnson picked it up carefully. The paper felt brittle with age, its edges yellowed by time. Across the front, written in steady black ink, were only two words: "For Ava." She looked at the handwriting and instantly recognized it. Harold Johnson. The room seemed to disappear around her. Even the gentle hum of the reactor faded into the background. She unfolded the letter with slow, careful hands. Inside, only a few lines filled the page. "If you are reading this, then the system did exactly what it was designed to do. It did not wait for the loudest voice. It waited for the person willing to listen." Ava closed her eyes for a brief moment. Her father had never expected applause. He had only hoped someone would protect people before protecting pride. She folded the letter again without wiping away the tears gathering quietly beneath her lashes. Behind her, no one interrupted the silence. Richard Whitmore stood several feet away, watching not as a chief executive officer, but as a man confronting the weight of his own decisions. He stepped forward slowly. Every polished footstep echoed across the now peaceful control room. The investors, engineers, and reporters instinctively made space between them. Nobody wanted to break what had become something far greater than a business emergency. Richard stopped beside Ava and looked through the observation window toward the quiet reactor below. The silver pipes reflected the first rays of morning sunlight filtering through the eastern glass wall. Hours earlier those same pipes had glowed with danger. Now they carried only warmth. Richard spoke without looking at her. Your father built something extraordinary, Ava answered softly. He believed every life inside this building mattered, whether anyone knew his name or not. Richard lowered his head. I spent years believing leadership meant being the smartest person in the room. He paused. Today I learned it means listening to the person who knows more than you. No one reacted with applause. No one needed to. The truth carried its own weight. Richard slowly removed the reserved parking key, executive security card, and engraved company access badge from his pocket. He placed them gently on the control console between them. This company forgot whose hands built it, he said quietly. That changes today. Ava looked at the items but made no move to touch them. Titles are easy to hand over, she replied. Trust takes longer. Richard nodded once. There was no defense left to offer. Only acceptance. Across the room, the lead systems manager quietly walked to the engineering display. Without asking permission, he opened the employee directory. Beneath Harold Johnson's archived profile, he added one line. Original Safety System Architect. Then beneath it another. Engineering Legacy Restored. Several engineers watched in respectful silence. One by one they stood. Not because someone ordered them to, but because gratitude felt more natural than remaining seated. The older mechanic smiled faintly before slipping back toward the maintenance hallway, unnoticed by almost everyone except Ava. Their eyes met for only a second. He tipped his worn cap, then disappeared into the quiet corridors where the plant had always depended on people whose names rarely appeared in reports. Outside, dawn settled over Whitmore Energy. The emergency vehicles rolled away without sirens. Reporters lowered their cameras. The cool morning air drifted through the open loading bay as the last traces of heat escaped into the sky. Ava stepped out of the building carrying nothing except her father's letter. She paused beside the Bronze Company sign where employees hurried past every day. The polished metal reflected her face beside the rising sun. For years that building had seen her uniform before it saw her mind. Today, every person who walked through those doors saw her first. She slipped the letter safely into her jacket, took one calm breath, and walked toward the morning light while, behind her, Richard Whitmore quietly held the door open until she had disappeared from view.